Muslims, between medieval historicism and Western historicism of Islam, miss on a very critical point. What got those people at the time of the Prophet ﷺ so excited about the Islamic message? The reason they got excited about the idea of La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah is because they understood it will transform the life that they are living. The colonized Muslim mind tells a story of, this worship of idols was so stupid and so on, and then Islam liberated people of their stupidity. And the Meccans were willing to say, go ahead, worship your one God, and we will worship our gods. But the constant complaint they had about Muhammad is that he is inciting the powerless and disempowered against their masters. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على محمد وآله وأصحابه واتبعوا بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. اللهم اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. We're still at the foundational stages. We're still talking about the first years of the da'wah. First 3 years, they are so critical to understanding everything. And what is particularly interesting in terms of assessing historical material, much of the Sirah in the Medinan period, this is now the period where you have active political issues, created incentives for partisan historical narratives. And I actually don't think that this is coincidence or unintentional. I think this is quite intentional by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that there is a divine purpose in this. There are many details, as inshallah as we'll see, where you are forced to do historical analysis and sort of reach a probability of evidence as to what probably took place in the Medinan period. And there are many events like that where you cannot be certain that XYZ took place because of the fact that there are partisan historical narratives and because of the involvement of political interests in the unfolding events. The Meccan period is far less so than this type of paradigm is not as weighty in the Meccan period as it is in the Medinan period. By the time that the Sirah and the Hadith are being documented in written form, the partisan question between kufr and iman, between belief and unbelief, is largely moot. And what is not moot are things that has to do with which tribe is in power, which clan is in power, which ethnic issues, class issues. These are issues that will impact upon narratives in Medinan period. Why do I say this or emphasize this? Because it is it's not coincidence that the foundations which are being laid in the Mecca period, we can reach a level of certitude as to much of these foundational issues equal to the certitude we reach about the Quranic narrative. Precisely because the foundations are so critical for the architecture of the architectural structure of Islam itself, that we find that this is true in historical narratives. To put it bluntly, because the foundations are so important, that I believe that it is not a coincidence that Allah allows us to understand and to see issues in this foundational period, in this Meccan period, far more conclusively than we do in the Medinian period. In the first 3 years, it would be simply a huge methodological error to overlook or ignore what Allah chooses to emphasize, the normative program, if you will, the moral architecture of Islam that Allah emphasizes from the very beginning of the da'wah. This is so intuitively clear. And what is it that was bringing people, attracting people to this faith? And what gave it the normative power that it did possess? When we hear, as we mentioned last halaqah, about people who embrace this faith and know that they are going to confront isolation and opposition, like as we said, we gave the example of Utbah bin Azwan last halaqah. This is the man who starved in Mecca to the point of eating the leaves of trees. What is it that animated them? What is it that activated and gave them that sense of commitment? Here, I want to point to sort of it's a subtle point, but it's an important point to understand. Knowledge in the world we live in is still dominated largely by Western institutions. One way or the other, you find that it is Western epistemology, Western norms that dominate the intellectual universe that we live in. Part of that domination, especially the spaces of colonized societies, including Islamic studies. There is a historical methodological point that is rather interesting, but again, that has been largely overlooked by Muslims I'm trying to think of exceptions, with very few exceptions. Most of the time when Western historians have scrutinized history and narrated history, whether it is the history of the West itself or the history of the other from Western eyes, the dominant and prevailing historical narrative or historical method is to look at material interests to explain the dynamics of history. In other words, to say, okay, in order to understand the movement, we have to understand what it did in terms of concrete material impact. That it is not simply the idea of that there is one God, but it must have been that this movement, for instance, empowered a class, raised class expectations, or had an impact upon the economic interests. Either in order to understand the movement, we have to understand the way economic interests were threatened or economic interests were promoted. That is a dominant historical methodology in nearly everything that historians in the modern age, through this dominant Western paradigm, or largely, and it doesn't need to be as far as historical materialism, the sort of the Marxist school of thought, but levels of it. So while not everything might be explained by class conflict, but definitely material interests is always examined and evaluated in order to understand either the success or a failure of anything. But we encounter a rather very interesting curiosity when it comes to understanding the rise of Islam in Western literature. And that curiosity, if you adopt that materialistic school of thought in understanding the Prophet ﷺ and the early converts to Islam and their empowerment and what they've in fact did achieve and what they aspire to achieve, if you adopt that materialistic school of thought, you end up with one possible conclusion. And it is really one possible conclusion: that you cannot understand wide-scale conversions to Islam or the power of conviction as to these converts, their willingness to commit and sacrifice. The one possible conclusion is that this message must have had a socially transformative impact upon people. According to a materialistic school of thought, you will say, well, the only way that people would be so thrilled about embracing this new religion is not because of some theoretical understanding of the divine. It is not because they are intellectually or philosophically opposed to idol worship and convinced of the worship of one and only God, but if they must have looked at the material consequences of this conviction and saw that this, in fact, had a socially and economically and materially transformative impact upon their life and the life of those that they care about. That's a classic materialistic outlook, right? Now, what is the irony that I'm pointing to? And as I said, it's a subtle point, but it's an important point, is that you will find that Western scholarship comes to early Islamic history and in fact refuses to embrace a materialistic interpretation of history. Why? Because they don't want to admit that this was indeed, if you want to call it a revolutionary program or a liberation program, because they understand that it is not, if you believe that human beings don't respond to abstract philosophy, that's not what animates human beings. It might animate a few human beings, but that the majority of human beings might be moved by abstract philosophy to some extent, but ultimately they want to see that anything they believe in is going to make a difference in their material life. If you believe that, then you must look at what was these sacrifices that we're talking about. Sacrifices like Abu Dharr, willing to go get a beating twice and basically break away from his style of life to embrace, and when he talks about the akhlaq of the Rasul alayhi salatu wasalam, if you are a non-materialist, if you adopt a non-materialist methodology of history, you would say, yes, the pure abstract belief in akhlaq is enough to animate, is enough to excite. But I don't know too many historians, in fact, I don't know of any at this point in the West that, in fact, does not embrace a materialistic, to some extent, a materialistic school of thought when it comes to understanding history. So then if you look to the materialist school of thought, you must recognize that there was something about this message that excited disempowered people, because they saw in this message their material empowerment. And that's what got these people to be so thrilled and energetic about changing their entire lives to follow this message. But Muslims often ignore that when they read Western sources, in fact, Western sources come to the Meccan period, and the way that they transform themselves into the idealistic school of history, in sense of completely ignoring the socially transformative program of Islam as an early message. Now, of course, this contradiction, this paradox in Western methodology, you can't blame your colonizer for having these mental black spots. A colonizer is influenced by their own power dynamics, and they see the world through the prism of their own empowerment, and they see all the high human values, such as liberation, emancipation, progress, as in themselves, but not in the other. So that is why we talk about the age of discovery, for instance. Was there an age of discovery? Discovery for whom? For the West. But it doesn't mean that anything was actually being discovered. There were people living where the West says we've discovered. Nothing was discovered. So, but why is it seen as the age of discovery? And why do textbooks still in schools talk about the age of discovery, although it is thoroughly racist to talk about the age of discovery, right? But why? Because of these blind spots in the sight of the empowered and the sight of the dominant. The hegemon will always see things with clarity only as to themselves. Now, this is really critical, because if Muslims didn't fall in the same trap, I wouldn't emphasize it. But that's precisely the problem, is that then Muslims come and they basically read these Western sources, or they read the medieval sources, and medieval sources where they were keepers of annals of history. They didn't analyze history. They basically would document events and dates. And the idea of history was to simply document events and dates and to not admit biases. That's the typical medieval style. And that biases would come in, would seep in through fantasies, through mythology. That the way you expressed your bias is by opening the door to mythology. That's typical medieval historicism. So Muslims, between sort of typical medieval historicism and Western historicism of Islam, they miss on a very critical point. To put it quite simply and quite bluntly, what got those people at the time of the Prophet ﷺ so excited about the Islamic message? It's as simple as that. And what I'm telling you is, yes, the idea of worshiping one God is exciting, but not if it has no practical consequences on the life you're living. The reason they got excited about the idea of La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah is because they understood it will transform the life that they are living. And in order to understand the transformation of life that we are talking about, all we have to do is to look at the earliest revelation. All Islam to them was not Bukhari, was not Muslim. I mean, there's a living example of the Prophet, but what was it? It was God talking to them. What was God telling them? You even take we took many examples last halaqah, but you take even one of the earliest examples, like أَرَأَيْتَ الَّذِي يُكَذِّبُ بِالدِّينِ. Okay, did you see that person who disbelieves? يُكَذِّبُ بِالدِّينِ means someone who rejects belief. Okay. Now, immediately, what is correlated and paralleled with at-takzib bid-din? Immediately, what is tied, connected, sort of associated with a disbeliever? فَذَلِكَ الَّذِي يَدُعُّ الْيَتِيمِ. Immediately, what is associated with disbelief? Mistreatment of orphans. وَلَا يَحُضُّ عَلَى طَعَامِ الْمِسْكِينِ. As we said last time, al-hadd al-shay is like a tawasi. It's not just they oppress the orphans, and it's not just they don't feed. The issue is not just that you don't feed the indigent, but that you don't advocate, you don't espouse, you don't preach the feeding of the indigent. وَلَا يَحُضُّ عَلَى طَعَامِ الْمِسْكِينِ. And then creates an association between a person that mistreats the orphans and does not think of feeding the indigent as a moral obligation. Because it's clear what it's talking about is a person that thinks that feeding the indigent is a moral obligation, and so he goes around preaching it and advocating it and working to achieve it, and a person who says, no, it's not an obligation. So that's, they don't respond to the hadd ala ta'am al-miskin because they don't think that there's an obligation to advocate it or achieve it. Then it gets to the point of فَوَيْلٌ لِلْمُصَلِّينَ الَّذِينَ هُمْ عَنْ صَلَاتِهِمْ. So then it gets to the point of, well, have you seen those who are not sincere about praying? So that, again, the idea of the architecture, what is the architecture? Okay, and the architecture is that if you pray, if you believe, then by definition, you have social awareness and social responsibility. And this is precisely, and as we will see, and again, you'll understand my larger point as we go, as we get deeper and deeper. You will see that in all the debates with the elite of Mecca, they are repeatedly expressing, when they, especially in the debates with Abu Talib, the Prophet's uncle, what they are constantly going back to, they even concede, as we will see, they concede, they say, why don't Muhammad worship his God? We'll let Muhammad and his followers worship their God. But leave our way of life alone. So it is not about, as the colonized Muslim mind has, it tells a story of, and this worship of idols was so stupid and so on, and then Islam liberated people of their stupidity. And well, the Meccans were willing to say, go ahead, worship your one God, and we will worship our gods. But the constant complaint they had about Muhammad is that he is inciting the powerless and disempowered against their masters. Time and time again, they come to Abu Talib and say, look, we can't speak to our slaves and give them orders anymore, because now they say they're equals. Look, this message is very dangerous because it is not just a quietist message sitting in a corner saying worship your God quietly and peacefully and ignore the world around you. It is a message that is constantly saying, shame on you, shame on you, shame on you. And shame on you for what? Yes, for worshiping idols, but for what moral, ethical, transformative program the worship of idols makes you do? And what is that? What is the moral error? What is the moral failure? The moral failure is precisely, as the Quran repeatedly tells us, when it talks about fakku raqaba, the liberating the enslaved or liberating the oppressed, or when it talks about the miskin, or when it talks about the orphan. In other words, your society, or when it talks about burying alive, your society is unjust because the elite get to enjoy their privileges and lets the other suffer. This points to a very important principle that is very clear. We will see it begins from the very first beginning, from the start of the Risala. And we will see it throughout until the death of the Prophet ﷺ, and that is the principle of the kaful. Now, unfortunately, the word kafala has a bad name today because of the Saudi or Gulfi kafil system. That, you go work in Saudi Arabia, you go work in Kuwait, you have to have a kafil. You have to have, but that terminology comes from where? A kafil means you have to have a guarantor, right? And the way it is done in the modern age, it's done very oppressively. It's done by the people in the Gulf, in Kuwait and Saudi and whatever. Basically, that person who acts as the guarantor has citizenship and you don't, and then that person abuses you and doesn't give you your rights, basically extorts you, because as your guarantor, but where it came from, it's a corruption of something very old that the Prophet taught from the very beginning. The system of kafala, to put it quite simply, is your problem is my problem, and my problem is your problem. We live in a system of social security. I mean, again, the corruption of language, right? We say social security here, we think of numbers and blah, blah, blah. But the system of kafala is social security. It means it is not the case that I can have food in my house and you can starve and you have no rights over me. So we repeatedly know. So when I say something like Utbah bin Azwan was starving in Mecca and eating leaves of trees, we know immediately when we read that, it meant that no one had food among Muslims in Mecca. We even know that intuitively. Even the most ignorant of us knows that intuitively. They know intuitively because we all are raised with the stories about how the Prophet ﷺ, people would come knocking at his door and he would give them what, he would say, okay, I have 2 dates here. You take one, I'll take. We all know these stories, but it's not stories about personal generosity. It is a system of kafala. That is why when the Prophet ﷺ in Mecca, as we all see, and then when they migrate to Medina, what is the first thing he does? He says, I'm going to create a system of mu'akha, a brotherhood, that each of you will be coupled with another person as their brother. Especially after the hijrah, what did this mean? It meant that you shared everything. You shared your home. This brother had a right to sleep in your house until they had their own house. You had to share your food. You had to share your resources with that brother. But it's the system of mu'akha, the system of brotherhood, was a step further than the system of kafala. And the system of kafala is the idea of my problem is my problem and your problem is your problem, was over. And we see this very clearly in the Sirah of when Muslims, and this is, again, human psychology is human psychology. I mean, when you joined the party of Muslims, you know you joined a real brotherhood and a real sisterhood. Not a fictitious one, but one that basically said, there is no way that you can get closer to Allah if you don't go through your brother and your sister. If you are going to live a selfish life, then your aspirations towards the divine will go nowhere. And we saw this repeatedly when we did the tafsir of the Quran. But I am underscoring it here because of how central this is in talking about any of the examples that we see in the Sirah. Let me put it again, intuitively. If you think of the demonic, in any context, in the context of brother and sister, in the context of father and child, or mother and child, if you think of the demonic in the context of husband and wife, does the demonic bring people together or split them apart? Intuitively, we know what the demonic does. The demonic always breaks things apart. Does the demonic, again, just out of common sense, that the demonic come in and say, take care of one another, depend on one another, rely on one another? Or does the demonic come and say, each of you should selfishly set boundaries around themselves and ignore the rest? Intuitively, we know what the demonic does. And when you know that intuitively, it is because of the intuitive sense that Allah puts in us of what is good and what is bad. Now, we philosophize, we overcome that intuitive sense by philosophies that will justify the selfish as a form of altruism, or a selfishness as a form of prolonged good, but we know that it goes against our intuitive senses. That the intuitive sense, and we see examples after examples, that movements in which there is a sense of fraternity and sorority, we know that these movements inevitably are far more successful than movements that are unable to achieve that. And yet we imagine that in our families, in our marriages, in our societies, that they can succeed without that sense of fraternity and sorority. This is one of the most striking things about the legacy of, like, what were they doing these first 3 years, and the small group of Muslims that eventually will come to about 60 Muslims in the first 3 years. What were they doing? And you find that the Prophet ﷺ was building not just the bridges, underscoring your bridges to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but also underscoring their bridges to one another. And that they shared their problems, they shared their destiny, they shared and this is the very heart of being a person with a cause. That sharing a cause means that you are sharing, by definition, you are sharing your lives together. مبدأ التكافل is quite critical, because the irony, and here is where you see where the hand of God is, or where the hand of the demonic is. Look at modern Muslims today, right? We all, but intuitively, again, we all know that if Israel is attacked, it doesn't take a genius to know that you will have supporters of Israel from all over the world donating tons of money, or even, as I've read an article about how in France there were 8,000 volunteers that went and joined the Israeli military. That's takaful. You are sharing. You are all bonded. We all know that if there is an attack, even if it's just not, we saw this in 9/11. An attack against the United States, we saw the visceral response in so many parts of the West. Whether it was Canada, Australia, New Zealand, or various countries in Europe, it was literally as if the attack was against them. And in fact, there was when you look at the speeches given at the time, so many of these speeches were saying, "Oh, the United States was attacked," but indeed we were attacked when the United States were attacked. And to the extent that many countries in the West declared a state of emergency even without a terrorist attack against them. And the examples are many of this. Or change their laws to pass tighter laws of anti-terrorism. Again, what is that? It is takaful. It is but look Contrast this to Muslims. I mean, when you have even you need to convince Muslims that somehow there is a problem when a genocide is being committed against one group of Muslims, and yet Egypt or Morocco or Jordan continues to do business, or Turkey continues to do business as if nothing is going on. Right as we speak now, the attacks against Iran. Muslims are so split and so divided that although they all pray to the same God, they all have the same, they all pray in the same way, they all fast Ramadan, they all do Hajj to the same place, etc., etc., etc. But yet, we all know that when a Muslim nation stands, it stands alone. If that is not proof of the demonic in our midst, I don't know what is. And I just, do we raise our children with the principles of takaful? Do we raise our societies with knowledge of the fact that in Islamic morality, you cannot fill your stomach if you know that your brethren and your sisters are going hungry? You cannot live enjoying your life in safety if you know that your brethren and sisters are suffering. Do Islamic schools emphasize these basic ethics? Is that the way we teach the Sirah? One other point, I always go back to the dua of the Prophet ﷺ because it is so critical in understanding the heart of this man at every stage. From this early period, Zayd ibn al-Arqam reported that he heard this dua, but when I did research, it's narrated by so many parties. There are in different versions. I mean, so it's obvious that they would hear that a large group of people heard basically the same dua, but remembered it slightly different. Why is it important? Because if we want to understand what the Prophet ﷺ was teaching his followers, the people who came to Islam, so what was he telling them? So we know that what the Quran was saying. We know that there are certain principles like takaful that were foundational to the Islamic message, that preaching against egocentrism and living a selfish life, well, I take care of myself and I take care of my family and that's it. It was again foundational, and this is for to what extent all of this is consistent with Western psychology or not, I don't know. Psychology is not my field, but I would. Those who are interested in systems that are consistent with Islamic ethics, this is something that is really important to examine and to study, because philosophically, at least, so much of Western philosophy would be at odds, would be inconsistent with the norms that the Prophet ﷺ taught. But the irony, again, is that although Western philosophy has often emphasized selfish paradigms, individualistic paradigms, what is, and this just requires study and analysis, because it's what Western civilization, perhaps it's on a racial basis, perhaps it's on a, I'm not sure, but it has reproduced the same civilizational values, or the values that we know are consistent with successful civilizations, even when they contradicted the dominant Western philosophies, like having an ummah, for instance, like the type of unity we see among Western civilization. So anyway, going back to the dua of the Prophet ﷺ. So imagine, because what is the point here is not that he is saying this dua just to Allah, but that he is teaching his followers through this dua. So if you are imagining yourself in that critical educational moment, receiving the earliest surahs of the Quran, but what else? You are hearing your prophet speak to God, and you are learning from the prophet, hearing him speak to God. You are learning how to speak to God. You are learning your own relationship to God through the example of the prophet. So this is an example of a dua that we have, again, cumulative transmissions, that it was among the earliest. اللهم ربنا ورب كل شيء أنا شهيد أنك الرب وحدك لا شريك لك. اللهم ربنا ورب كل شيء أنا شهيد أن محمدا عبدك ورسولك. اللهم ربنا ورب كل شيء أنا شهيد أن العباد كلهم إخوة. اللهم ربنا ورب كل شيء اجعلني مخلصا لك وأهلي في كل ساعة من الدنيا والآخرة يا ذا الجلال والإكرام. اسمع واستجب. So God, it says Allah, who is the Lord of everything. I bear witness that, and imagine the what passion this expressed when you are talking to God this way, and you are saying, God, I am bearing witness that you are the Lord of everything, and you are singular in your sovereignty, in your power. There is nothing like you. And it is, how do you bear witness that Muhammad is the messenger when you are Muhammad? Well, this is precisely because bearing witness that Muhammad is the messenger, it's not about Muhammad as a human being. It is about the truthfulness of the message itself. So it's like saying, it is not about me, but I bear witness that I am believing what you have ordained for me to believe. Then, which again, we have so many cumulative transmissions when the Prophet comes and says after that, I bear witness that al-ibad kulluhum ikhwa, that all human beings are brothers and sisters, because ukhwa means brothers and sisters. We all, this same dua, by the way, we have narrated on behalf of Imam Ali, which it doesn't surprise me because he must have heard the Prophet ﷺ say it, and then Imam Ali repeated it. But so you are telling God, I understand you are one and singular and sovereign, and that human beings all share this brotherhood and this bond. Well, we know that the brotherhood comes from the fact that we are all the sons and daughters of Adam and Eve. But beyond that, what does this brotherhood among human beings entail? And when we look at the Quran paralleled with the way that the Prophet spoke to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to put it quite simply, entailed caring and a system of takaful, that you care, and you care to the point of taking care of the other, that you are not living oblivious to the other. Now, again, that doesn't mean that you go around depressed about affairs of other human beings, because the depression is not going to help anyone. That is not the point. But the point is that you do not understand your sense of moral obligations as beginning and ending with you and with your own well-being, because that is simply insufficient. Then what does the Prophet ﷺ supplicates for? Supplicates for ikhlas, for sincerity. And sincerity in serving God and serving the Ahl, his people. Ahl literally would translate as his family. When you think of the gift of sincerity, it is a true gift, that you because when you know that insincerity can creep up and what is at the heart of insincerity? It is a form of selfishness. It is always selfish desires come in to make one insincere and thus a hypocrite to one extent or another. And they are always malicious and always unexamined. They literally sneak in like snakes, literally. So when the Prophet himself and teaching not his followers supplicate for sincerity, because sincerity is a great gift. And isma' washtajib, and look when he says, then the supplication goes, Allahu Akbar, Nuru samawati wal ard, Allahu Akbar, Hasbi Allah wa ni'mal wakil. We say these phrases now without thinking about them, but think of the man who first articulated this dua and taught it to his followers. They say it is, you are talking to God, so you are acknowledging, when you say Allah Akbar, God is the greatest, and the light of the heavens and the earth, you are reminding yourself and you are testifying and affirming. By repeating it, if failing to repeat a truth is conducive to forgetting that truth, the more you repeat a truth, the more it settles in your heart, and your comprehension of a truth expands. So when we see that the Prophet ﷺ, from the very first beginning of the da'wah, is constantly teaching his followers, repeat that Allah is the light, that the light, affirm that the light does exist, you don't live in darkness, and that this light is the divine. And then Hasbi Allah wa ni'mal wakil, and it is, and Allah is the best of allies, that Allah is my sufficient support in everything. Another dua that which we know again from the very first, among the very earliest, and again it's reported so cumulatively, and so he's teaching his followers. So that's dua. We can break it into components, if you will. So we can break this dua into components. So it starts out with the Prophet ﷺ speaking to God and saying, Allah, I know that you know what is best. I don't know what is best. So if you know life to be better for me, then preserve me. And if you know that death to be better for me, then take me. So he's teaching his followers attitude towards life on this earth. It is not the case that you should hold on to this life on this earth as if it is the end all. But in fact, you are and remember that these are the people who will then be asked to put themselves in harm's way in battle. So you are starting out by saying that, life and death on this earth is not everything. And I leave it, I fully accept that if God's knowledge that it is better for me not to be on this earth, so then be it. This dua will continue on to say, وَأَسْأَلُكَ بَرْدَ الْعَيْشِ بَعْدَ الْمَوْتِ, which is all, we say that, and I ask you, بَرْدَ الْعَيْش means, this way to translate it is tranquil or pleasant or fulfilling life after death. So you are also worried about your existence after death, and this is an ilm al-ghayb. We don't know what existence after death looks like, but Allah does, and you are asking Allah to take care of you beyond that point that you are not on this earth. So that's one component. Second component, Allah, inni as'aluka khashyataka fil ghaybi wa shahada. Help me. The khashya here is often translated as fear, but khashya is to be always aware of something. So you are asking God, you are praying, supplicating to God, Allah, help me never be forgetful of you and what you demand of me. Then what does he teach his followers next? وَأَسْأَلُكَ كَلِمَةَ الْحَقِّ فِي الرِّضَى وَالْغَضَبِ. That I ask you that I speak the word of truth and justice. Here in this context, it would be truth and justice in anger and when I'm not angry. And this is, again, if you are being educated by this man, he's telling you, note that anger is not an excuse. That part of what you, in the same way you are asking God for full awareness of God, full awareness of God would teach you your moral responsibility, whether you are angry or calm, because so much injustice and so much immorality is committed in anger. وَأَسْأَلُكَ الْقَصْدَ فِي الْفَقْرِ وَالْغِنَى. This is again level. It's a philosopher. It's an intuitive philosopher. القصد في الفقر والغنى. Qasd is fairness. So he's saying, God help me, whether I am poor or rich, to always be fair. So whether I'm angry or calm, to always be just, and whether I am poor or rich, to always be fair. Now, because each has its challenges. If you are rich, the challenge is that you don't want to give. If you are poor, the challenge is what? Is to justify curing your poverty through any unethical means. You say, well, I am poor, and because I'm poor, then the ends justify the means, and I should be able to not be poor, regardless of and the Prophet ﷺ is, I mean, it's an entire school of morality. Where the Prophet ﷺ is saying, God, whether it is not, the issue is not now, the issue is when I am challenged, when I am tested. And I have no doubt, especially in the dua that is heard by his followers, that he, in all of this dua, is teaching them. And that's the point that I keep underscoring, is that this is, we often look at this dua as, oh, the Prophet just did dua. No, the Prophet was teaching. وأسألك قرة عين لا تنقطع وأسألك الرضا بعد القضاء وأسألك برد العيش بعد الموت. So that this part, that I am, what I, again, my dua to you, what I am pleading with you to give me is rida, is that I would be satisfied and accepting of your will. Whatever it is, whatever your will is, that it does not become a source of consternation or vindictiveness or anger, or because all the levels of unsettlement and all the at the heart of so much spiritual malaise is dissatisfaction and just being in a state of insecurity and unsettlement. To me, this is, and I'm sure that, again, imagine these early followers when they hear their teacher say, وَأَسْأَلُكَ لَذَّةَ النَّظَرِ إِلَى وَجْهِكَ وَالشَّوْقَ إِلَى لِقَائِكَ. That I'm also asking that the pleasure or the joy, the ecstasy of gazing upon your face and the joy of meeting you. So if you are following this teacher, God is personalized, because it is not, your teacher is not doing dua that Allah give me the wine and the food and the whatever in Jannah. What I want, what I aspire for is unity, is this meeting with the divine, that I gaze upon your face. Of course, here, gaze is experience the divine in the way we would experience the divine. Allah, do you really gaze upon the face of the divine? I mean, do we take it in a literal sense? I don't think so. But that your aspirations is to experience the divine in such a profoundly personal and liberating and illuminating fashion that it personalizes God to you in a liberating way. So again, when you look at and as because we're going to emphasize a lot of these stories. Well, why would Abu Dharr, and when Abu Dharr describes Abu Dharr al-Ghafari, you remember he's the guy that was beaten, goes and basically proclaims his Islam and gets a beating. And this is after he met with the Prophet ﷺ. His first, he's skeptical. He talks to his brother. His brother tells him, oh, this man is in Mecca, and he travels to Mecca. And as if you remember the story, he stays with Imam Ali for 3 days and nights, but eventually he meets the Prophet, and the meeting is so overwhelming for him, and that he goes and he proclaims that he's a Muslim, and he's ganged upon and beaten twice. But then when his mother asks him, why did you become a Muslim? And he says, because I met a man أفضل قومه مروءة. I met a man. There is no one who is more chivalrous and kind and giving. Muru'ah is all of these things, is chivalry, kindness. I met a man who no one amongst his people is more chivalrous, more kind, more giving. وَأَحْسَنُهُمْ خُلْقًا. And I met someone who, amongst his people, no one has better ethics. وَأَكْرَمَهُمْ مُخَالَطًا. And when you sit with him, you are elevated. When you interact with him, you are elevated. وَأَعْظَمَهُمْ حِلْمًا وَأَمَانًا. And I have not met anyone who is more truthful and trustworthy. وَأَصْدَقَهُمْ حَدِيثًا. And more truthful in his speech. وَأَبْعَدَهُمْ مِنَ الْفُحْشِ وَالْأَذَى. And this is like, if underscore this, because he says, and I have not met, and I never met someone who is more remote or distant from al-fuhsh wal-adha. Fuhsh is obscenities and immoral acts, and adha is harm. So it's like saying I met someone who I can't imagine would harm anyone, and I can't imagine ever being obscene. And he says, وَمَا رَأَى مُلَاحِيًا أَبَدًا وَلَا مُمَارِيًا أَحَدًا حَتَّى سَمَّاهُ قَوْمٌ بِالْأَمِينِ. So to the point that it is not imaginable that he would lie to anyone or betray anyone or be cruel towards anyone, to the point that his own people called him Al-Amin, the trustworthy, right? يَدْعُو إِلَى اللَّهِ بِالْحُسْنَى وَيَنْهَى عَنِ الْفَحْشَاءِ وَالْمُنْكَرِ. That the way his da'wah, the way he teaches, bil-husna, is with kindness, with gentleness. That husna. And what all his teaching is against things that are immoral. That's what al-fahsha'i wal-munkar mean in this context. So then he says, فَشَهِدْتُ أَنَّ لَا إِلَهَ إِلَّا اللَّهُ وَأَنَّ مُحَمَّدًا. So, and when I met this man and I saw all these things, that's why I took the shahada. Because we have in the modern age people who try to minimize the role of the Prophet in da'wah and the moral example of the Prophet. Imagine the morality of this man. But again, he is modeling, and that Allah picks a moral model in order for us to learn from that moral model, and not in order for us to marginalize it or ignore it or say that it, and that has to work in tandem with with Allah's revelation. It's like hand in hand. So the message cannot conflict, cannot contradict. What you find in the Sirah and Ahadith cannot be inconsistent with the morality of the Quran, because they work in tandem. It's like, you know, the concept of nashaz, or disharmony, or atonality in music. You can't have that disharmony in the music of Islamic ethics. And you see this quite clearly in the dua as educational material to the followers of the Prophet ﷺ. And I see the dua as modeling to be far more reliable than singular ahadith in which someone is claiming that they heard the Prophet say, do or don't, in a singular ahad fashion. That doesn't give me, it gives me a little decontextualized claim of sama' that, if any student of history would know is immediately suspect, because what is far more reliable is what is contextualized as part of a moral process, rather than these isolated, often quite without a context, narratives of reports. Okay.